So earlier I was on Facebook and I was going back and forth arguing on a Facebook post, and there was a gentleman named Rich House who who suggested that we have an online live Facebook debate, and of course I accepted. We had a live Facebook debate. It lasted about an hour long, and I just want to recap a few of the things that we went over. So my first main point was we were talking about systemic racism, and I was talking about laws. And I think we both came to an agreement that there are currently no racist laws on the books. And then the next thing that he had mentioned was we were talking about racial bias in police as it relates to fatal police shootings. I posted Washington Post statistics that show that there was, in 2019, there was 14 unarmed black people that were killed at the hands of police. There was 25 white people unarmed that were killed at the hands of police. And he was claiming that that black people are killed at higher rates than white people. And if you look at the numbers alone, as they relate back to their respective populations, the respective populations of black people, the respective populations of white people, and how many of them were killed by police unarmed in a given year, proportionally, it shows that black people were killed at higher rates. But I said a very important lurking variable that needs to be accounted for when you are trying to determine the likelihood of the police shooting an unarmed person is police interactions. This seemed to be a really, really tough concept for Rich House. He kept asking for evidence. What evidence do you have that police interactions lead to police shootings? Can you show me empirical data? Well, Rich, this is a pretty easy common sense argument. If you have no police interactions, what are the chances of you getting shot by police? 0. If you have police interactions, the chances go up from there. And then I pointed it back to crime statistics. Black people commit crime at a disproportional rate, at a higher disproportional rate than white people. This is a fact. This is data. And I think we were both in agreement on this. I think we were both in agreement that this is legitimate collected data that anyone can look up and verify. So as I was saying, that the more police interactions you have, the more likely you are to get killed by police. And that is what's happening here. When you look at statistics like murder statistics, the fact that black men account for 6% of the population, but commit 52% of the murders, you can see why they would have much more frequent police interactions. The more police interactions you have, the more likely you are to have a violent police interaction. Specifically the most violent type of police interaction, which would be a fatal police shooting. And then the other points that Rich House brought up were about empirical data relating to, it was relating to banking, relating to healthcare, and relating to name bias as it relates to applying for jobs. So for these points right here, I'm going to share my screen. So what Rich House had done is he had sent me links to the empirical data that he had cited. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show you all of the empirical data that he had sent me, and we're going to go through them one by one. All right, we're back, and here's the first article now that I've shared my screen with you that he had sent me, and I read through it. I mean, it's a pretty big, long article, but let's jump right to the main point of the article right here, the conclusion, and you can see I highlighted it for you right here, and I mean, they're basically saying that black people are more likely to die of heart disease, cancer, and diabetes, but one of the statistics that you never find in this article is that black people are more likely to be obese, which can lead to diabetes and a whole other plethora of health problems, which I think we can both agree obesity is self-induced. So when you look at healthcare disparities and you say that, look, we have diabetes and a bunch of other conditions that are running rampant in the black community, you cannot ignore the differences in obesity rates in these communities, which it's very clear, and you could look it up. Black people in black communities, there is a higher likelihood of obesity. So when you're looking at these numbers, you have to look at the underlying data that could have possibly led to these numbers. Very, very important. And now moving on right here to the next article. This one is about banking, how black people are just discriminated against in the financial institutions. And I highlighted the main points right here. In major white counties, there are an average of 41 financial institutions for every 100,000 people compared to 27 in non-white. So what they're saying right here is in white neighborhoods, there's more banks than there are in black neighborhoods. Racist, right? This means that banks are racist. Well, let's think about this for a second. A bank is a business. Do you really think if there was a higher demand for banks in these communities, that banks would handicap themselves? They are so racist that they don't want black money. They only want white money. A bank is not going to open up a bank in a black neighborhood, even though there's demand, because they're racist against black people. Maybe this is a function of demand. In black communities, as me and Rich House both discussed, black communities are plagued by poverty by far and large, so we can agree that black neighborhoods have less money than white neighborhoods. Does it not make sense that banks want to be in communities where there is more money, where there is more demand for the banks? So moving on to the next point here. So then it goes on to say that right here, the average minimum balance in white neighborhoods was $626 compared with the average bank balance in black neighborhoods, which was $871. So the point they're making here is that they're saying in these black neighborhoods that banks were requiring people to have higher balances than white neighborhoods. So this proves racism. Well, let's take a step back here. First thing you need to look at is you need to look at that specific bank. Are banks requiring black people to have higher balances than white people at the same bank? You go to that same bank. I show up to the bank, and they say, okay, well, Brian Thanos, you could have a minimum balance of $500. And then we have Rich House shows up, for example. Rich House, a black man, shows up, and they go, no, Rich House, you're a black man. You have to have $1,000 in your bank account. Is that what's happening? Or let's take a look at possibly another angle. Banks or businesses. Going back to my earlier point, banks like to pool people's money together. The worst thing that can happen to a bank are two things. Number one, everyone tries to withdraw their money at once. Or number two, there's a lot of overdrafts. So think about this. If you are pooling money together, does it not make sense that if you have less money, if you're in a neighborhood where there's less money, and maybe people are more likely to overdraft, that you would require a higher bank balance in order to cover yourself? So these are just a few of the questions that I have. And I think they're very, very important to look at when we're trying to point to the underlying cause. Because when you see these things, people immediately assume that any inequality equals racism, when by far and large, there are many examples where this just isn't true at all. So you have to look at the underlying causes. All right, now down to the last one right here. Name bias as it reports to employers. So the claim here is that employers are more likely to respond to applicants putting their name down on resume as white-sounding names rather than black-sounding names. This was the data that Rich had sent me via Facebook. I had found some other data that was contradictory to this data that suggested that there was no bias at all in terms of putting black, white, Spanish, or Asian names on an applicant's resume. And Rich did not like my study. He didn't like my data. So the data that I had presented, instead of using African-sounding first names, they just specifically looked at last names, and they used last names like Jefferson and Washington, which most people, I think we can all agree that those are typically last names of black people. And then they also use Spanish last names as well, like Garcia and like Melendez, I believe. And then when they sent out all their applications, they said it came back and the response rate was nearly identical, whether your last name was white, Spanish, or black. But once again, Rich did not like my data, so we're going to go with his data because he was more focused on the first names. And this data right here concludes that if you have an African-sounding first name, that you're much less likely to get a call back from a job than a white-sounding name. So first off, this the one that he had originally sent me, this article right here, is about 20 years old, and I was a little bit skeptical because, as I had mentioned in the debate many times, if you're going to say that having an African-sounding name disqualifies you from having a job, it's just a hard argument to make when a person with an African-sounding name was a two-term president that ended up leaving the White House with the highest approval rate in the history of U.S. presidents, right? So I felt that was a difficult argument to make, but let's just assume that what he is saying is true, that there is name privilege here in the U.S., that the most egregious, indisputable incidents of racism in America is name privilege. And there's some people that have the name privilege of having a name like Brian. And there's some people that don't have name privilege, and they have names like Jamal and Tyrone. Of course, I find this slightly ironic that the person presenting me with the argument has a name like Rich. So even he has this so-called name privilege. So this is the most egregious incidence of racism in America is name privilege. We're not even citing racism at this point. This is namesism. America is a namesist country. We discriminate against names that we don't like. And I mean, this goes much broader than black names because studies show that we looked at Spanish names, we look at Asian names. I find it interesting that when a lot of Asian people move here, instead of using their foreign names that they have overseas, they immediately change their name to like John or Kevin or Carl, right? And these are obviously not their real names, so maybe they are in tune with the possibility that there is name discrimination. It seems that Rich's parents must have thought this because he doesn't have an African-sounding name, so that's what this boils down to. And if you were to look at the easiest things that a person could possibly change about themselves, well, first, let's look at things that you can't change, right? You can't change the color of your skin. You can't change your race. You can't change your height. You can change your weight. It might not be easy, right? I mean, you could put on a little bit of muscle. You could lose some fat. You could change the way your body is shaped. It could be kind of difficult. But then we go to name. It's probably the easiest thing to change other than your t-shirt. The only thing you have to do is go to the courthouse, fill out some documents. It takes about 15 minutes. And you too could have the wonderful privilege of name privilege with a name like Brian or a name like Rich. So that's my video for today, and I encourage you all to watch the debate between me and Rich House. I thought it was a fun debate. It was a good debate. I want to thank Rich House for even agreeing to do the debate because a lot of people will talk a whole lot of trash on Facebook, and they just want to hide behind the keyboard. So much respect to Rich for even showing up and doing the debate, and I hope we can have another. Thank you.